Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we're diving deep into the tumultuous world of Greek mythology to explore the complete life of one of the most powerful and tempestuous gods ever to grace Mount Olympus. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin our journey through the story of Poseidon, the mighty god of the seas. Before we begin, if you happen to like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It really helps me a lot. That's all. Now back to the video. When you think of the ocean, what comes to mind? Perhaps the gentle lapping of waves on a peaceful shore, or maybe the terrifying fury of a storm-tossed sea. The ancient Greeks understood that the waters which surrounded their world embodied both of these extremes, and they personified this duality in Poseidon, a god whose moods could shift as quickly as the tides themselves. His story spans the entirety of Greek mythology, from the darkest days of the Titans' reign through the golden age of the Olympians and beyond. Tonight, we'll follow his path from his perilous birth, through his rise to power, his loves and rivalries, his role in the great wars of gods and men, and the legacy that would echo through millennia. But before we can understand Poseidon the god, we must first understand Poseidon the child, born into a world of fear and prophecy, swallowed whole by his own father, and destined to help reshape the very cosmos itself. In the beginning, before Poseidon drew his first breath, the world was ruled not by the Olympians we know today, but by an older, more primal generation of deities. The Titans, children of the earth herself, held dominion over all creation. Among them stood Cronus, youngest of the Titans, who had violently overthrown his own father Uranus to claim the throne of the universe. Cronus had learned cruelty from his father, and like so many who seize power through violence, he lived in constant fear of losing what he had taken. That fear had a name, and it came in the form of a prophecy. The same fate that Cronus had inflicted upon his father, it was foretold, would be visited upon him in turn. One of his own children would rise up and cast him down, just as he had done to Uranus. This knowledge poisoned every moment of Cronus's reign, turning what should have been joy into paranoia and transforming his palace into a prison of his own making. His wife was Rhea, a Titaness of grace and fertility, who bore child after child to the king of the Titans. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, then Demeter, who would one day make the earth bloom, then Hera, proud and regal even in infancy. Each time Rhea gave birth, each time she held a newborn child in her arms and looked into eyes that had just opened to see the world for the first time, Cronus would take that child from her and, driven by prophecy and fear, swallow it whole. The children did not die within their father's belly. They could not die, for they were immortal. Instead, they remained trapped in darkness, growing but never aging, aware but imprisoned, waiting in that terrible void for a salvation they had no reason to believe would ever come. When Rhea became pregnant for the 5th time, she knew with a mother's certainty that this child, like all the others, would be torn from her arms and condemned to that same horrific fate. This child was Poseidon, and in most tellings of the myth, his story begins the same way as his siblings. At the moment of his birth, Cronus appeared, his face a mask of grim determination, and without ceremony or tenderness, he opened his mouth impossibly wide and swallowed his newborn son. Down, 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 Poseidon fell into that living darkness, where he joined his brothers and sisters in their strange captivity. There was Hestia, first swallowed and longest imprisoned. There was Demeter, who would one day teach mankind to cultivate the earth. There was Hera, already displaying the fierce pride that would define her. And there was Hades, dark and brooding even then, who would eventually rule the underworld. They existed in a state beyond comprehension, neither truly alive nor dead, neither awake nor asleep, suspended in time within their father's body as the years stretched on and the world outside continued to turn. But there exists another version of Poseidon's birth, one less commonly told but no less fascinating. In this alternative account, Rhea, having already lost 4 children to her husband's paranoia, decided that she would not lose a 5th. When the time came for Poseidon to be born, she did not present the infant to Cronus. Instead, she enacted an elaborate deception. Rhea gave birth in secret, perhaps in a hidden grove or a remote cave far from Cronus's palace. She wrapped not her newborn son, but a young foal, a baby horse, in swaddling clothes. When Cronus demanded to see his latest child, Rhea presented him with this bundle, claiming she had given birth not to a god, but to a horse. Cronus, either fooled by the disguise or perhaps not caring enough to look closely at what he was about to destroy, swallowed the foal whole, believing he had once again forestalled his prophesied doom. Meanwhile, the true Poseidon was spirited away to safety. Some versions of this myth say that Rhea entrusted her infant son to a spring nymph named Athena, who raised him in secret. When Cronus eventually came searching for the child, asking the nymph if she had seen or harbored a newborn god, Athena bravely denied any knowledge of the baby. For her courage and loyalty, the spring where she dwelt was thereafter called by her name. Other accounts claim that Rhea gave Poseidon to the Telchines, ancient inhabitants of the island of Rhodes, mysterious beings who were said to possess great magical powers. Under their care, the young god was nurtured by Kythera, an Oceanid nymph who became his nurse. According to this version, Poseidon grew from infant to child to youth on Rhodes, far from his father's reach. Some traditions suggest it was there, in his adolescence, that he first encountered Halia, the beautiful sister of the Telchines, though the details of this early relationship remain uncertain in the ancient sources. This alternative version of Poseidon's birth is particularly intriguing because it connects directly to his later association with horses, one of the defining aspects of his divine portfolio. The idea that his mother disguised him as a foal, that Cronus swallowed a horse instead of a god, creates a mythological link that helps explain why Poseidon, primarily known as the god of the seas, was also revered as the creator and tamer of horses. In the ancient Greek imagination, these connections mattered. They wove together the various aspects of a deity's nature into a coherent whole, even if that whole contained contradictions and multiple versions of the same events. However, despite the appeal of this alternative telling, the more widely accepted version of the myth has Poseidon sharing the same fate as his siblings, swallowed by Cronus and imprisoned within him. This is the version that most ancient sources follow, and it's the one that leads most directly to the events that would eventually free not just Poseidon, but all of Cronus's children. For whether Poseidon spent his early years trapped in his father's belly or hidden away on a distant island, one thing was certain. The prophecy that Cronus feared so desperately was already coming to pass. Rhea had grown tired of losing her children, and when she became pregnant for a 6th time, she made a different choice. This child, Zeus, was hidden away on the island of Crete, raised in secret by nymphs and the goat Amalthea. He grew strong and clever, and when he reached adulthood, he returned to challenge his father. The details of Zeus's stratagem vary from telling to telling. In some versions, he disguised himself as a cupbearer and gained access to Cronus's court. In others, he enlisted the aid of Metis, a titaness of wisdom and cunning, but the result was always the same. Zeus gave his father a powerful emetic, a potion that caused violent vomiting, and Cronus, unable to control his body's rebellion, began to expel everything he had swallowed. Out they came, one by one, Cronus's swallowed children emerging from his mouth in reverse order of how they had been consumed. First came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, Demeter, and finally Hestia, who had been swallowed first and thus came out last. Because Poseidon was the second child to emerge, he would sometimes be referred to as the second youngest, even though by birth order he had been the 5th of 6 children. Each emerged not as the infant who had been swallowed, but as a fully grown god. powerful and ready for war, their bodies forged in that dark place into something magnificent and strong. Imagine that moment. After years, perhaps decades, or even longer, of existence in that terrible void, suddenly there was light, there was air, there was space to move and breathe and be. And standing before him was a young god with eyes, like storms, his brother Zeus, who had freed him and who now offered him a choice: join the rebellion against their father or remain enslaved forever. There was no real choice to make. Poseidon, along with Hades and their sisters, pledged themselves to Zeus's cause. Together, the 6 siblings would challenge not just Cronus, but the entire order of Titan rule that had existed since the dawn of time. The age of the Titans was drawing to a close, and the age of the Olympians was about to begin, born in fire and blood and divine fury. But before the Olympians could claim their thrones, they would have to fight for them. The war that followed would be known as the Titanomachy, the clash of Titans and Olympians, a conflict so vast and terrible that it would shake the foundations of the cosmos itself. And in that war, Poseidon would prove himself not just a survivor, but a warrior whose power over water and earth would make him one of the most formidable fighters on either side of the battlefield. The Titanomachy was not a war of weeks or months. It was a war of years, a decade-long struggle that consumed the world and left scars that would never fully heal. When Zeus freed his siblings from Cronus's belly, he knew that he could not defeat the Titans with just 6 Olympians, no matter how powerful they might be. The Titans had ruled for ages, and their strength was immense. Cronus himself was a formidable opponent, and he had allies: his brothers Iapetus, Hyperion, Coeus, and Creus, as well as Atlas and Menoetius, the sons of Iapetus. Together, they made up a force that seemed unbeatable. Zeus needed allies of his own, and he found them in the most unlikely of places. Deep beneath the earth, in the pit of Tartarus, lay prisoners who had been locked away since the very beginning of time. First were the Cyclopes, 3 brothers named Brontes, Steropes, and Arges, each possessing a single eye in the center of his forehead. They were master craftsmen, blacksmiths of divine skill, but they had been imprisoned first by Uranus and then by Cronus, who feared their power. Alongside them were the Hecatoncheires, or the 100-handed ones, Briareus, Cottus, and Gyges, giants of such terrible might that each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms. Zeus descended into Tartarus and freed these ancient prisoners. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged weapons of unprecedented power. For Zeus, they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure lightning that could be thrown like a spear and would always return to its wielder's hand. For Hades, they fashioned the helm of darkness, a cap of invisibility that would allow its wearer to move unseen even by the gods themselves. And for Poseidon, they created the trident. The trident was no ordinary weapon. It was a 3-pronged spear, each prong gleaming with divine metal that would never dull or break. But more than just a weapon, it was a symbol and a tool of immense power. With the trident, Poseidon could command the seas. He could summon waves as tall as mountains. He could calm the fiercest storms or conjure them from clear skies. He could strike the earth and cause it to shake and split, sending earthquakes rolling across the land. The trident was an extension of Poseidon's will, and with it in his hands, he became a force of nature itself. The Hecatoncheires joined the fight as well, their 100 hands hurling massive boulders at the Titan forces with such speed and ferocity that the sky itself seemed to rain stone. With these powerful allies at their side, the Olympians finally had a chance at victory. The war was fought on multiple fronts. The Olympians established their base on Mount Olympus in the north, while the Titans held Mount Othrys in the south. Between these 2 strongholds, the battles raged. The earth was scorched by divine fire. The seas boiled and churned. The sky was torn by lightning and thunder. Entire mountains were leveled. Rivers changed their courses. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear at the seams as gods fought gods in contests of unimaginable violence. Poseidon fought with the fury of someone who had been imprisoned for far too long. Every swing of his trident, every earthquake he summoned, every tsunami he sent crashing across the battlefield was powered not just by divine strength, but by years of pent-up rage at what had been done to him and his siblings. The seas became his weapon, and he wielded them with devastating effect. When Titan forces gathered on the shores, Poseidon would call up the waters to sweep them away. When they tried to cross rivers, he would turn those rivers into raging torrents that drowned any who tried to ford them. But Poseidon's greatest contribution to the war was not just his individual might. He worked in concert with his siblings, particularly with Zeus. While Zeus rained down lightning from above and Hades struck from the shadows, Poseidon attacked from below, using earthquakes to destabilize the Titans' positions and floods to wash away their defenses. The three brothers developed an almost telepathic coordination, each instinctively knowing where the others would strike next. Not all Titans fought for Cronus. The Titaness Themis, goddess of divine law and order, sided with the Olympians, foreseeing that justice lay with the younger gods. Her son Prometheus, the far-sighted one, also joined Zeus's forces, using his gift of prophecy and his cunning mind to help the Olympians outmaneuver their enemies. Oceanus, the Titan god of the great river that encircled the world, chose neutrality, refusing to commit his strength to either side. As the 10th year of the war approached, both sides were exhausted. Gods do not tire as mortals do, but even divine beings can be worn down by a decade of constant warfare. It was then that the tide began to truly turn in the Olympians' favor. The Hecaton shearers, with their 100 hands and 50 heads each, proved to be an overwhelming force. They picked up entire mountains and hurled them at the Titan army. The Cyclopes continued to forge weapons and repair those that were damaged, ensuring the Olympians never wanted for arms. In some accounts, it was Hades who struck the decisive blow. Wearing his helm of darkness, he snuck into the Titan camp on Mount Othrys and destroyed their weapons and armor, leaving them defenseless. In other versions, it was simply the accumulated might of the Olympian forces, pressing forward in a final, desperate assault that broke the Titan lines. Either way, the result was the same. The Titans were defeated. Cronus, who had once overthrown his own father, was now overthrown by his sons. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies as battlefield commander, was singled out for special punishment. He was condemned to hold up the sky itself, bearing its weight on his shoulders for all eternity. The other Titans, except for those who had sided with Zeus, were cast down into Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld. There they were imprisoned behind bronze gates, guarded by the Hecaton sharers, who owed their freedom to the Olympians and would never allow the Titans to escape. The war was over. The Olympians had won. But victory brought with it new questions and new challenges. Chief among them, who would rule what? The universe was vast, and while Zeus had led the rebellion and freed his siblings, even he acknowledged that the cosmos was too large for any single god to rule alone. The three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, were the most powerful of the Olympians. Together, they had defeated the Titans. Now, they would have to decide how to divide the world among themselves. The decision was made not through combat or argument, but through chance. The three brothers drew lots, a method that was considered fair because it left the outcome in the hands of fate itself. 3 straws, or stones, or lots, each marked with a different realm, were drawn from a container. What each brother received would be his to rule for all eternity. Zeus drew first, or perhaps longest, depending on the telling. He received the sky, the realm of clouds and storms, of thunder and lightning, the domain from which he could look down upon all the world. With this came the role of king of the gods, leader of the Olympians, the one to whom the others would look for judgment and guidance. The sky was the highest realm, and from it, Zeus would reign supreme. Hades drew next, or perhaps shortest. He received the underworld, the realm of the dead, the shadowy kingdom beneath the earth, where mortal souls went after their lives ended. It was a dark domain, one that most would not have wanted, but Hades accepted it with his characteristic stoicism. The underworld would be his to rule, and he would do so with absolute authority, becoming in time a figure both feared and respected. And Poseidon received the seas. To modern ears, this might not sound like a punishment, or even like a particularly difficult lot. After all, the ocean covers most of the planet's surface. But we must understand this choice in the context of ancient Greek thought. The sea was vast, yes, but it was also dangerous, unpredictable, and separate from the main centers of power and civilization. While Zeus would rule from Mount Olympus, surrounded by other gods and able to directly oversee the affairs of mortals, Poseidon's kingdom was one of water and salt, of depths no mortal could plumb, of storms that destroyed ships and waves that drowned sailors. Yet Poseidon did not complain. He took his trident and descended to the depths, and there he made his home. Deep beneath the waves, he built palaces of such magnificence that they rivaled even Olympus itself. These undersea halls were constructed of coral and crystal, decorated with pearls and gems salvaged from shipwrecks, illuminated by bioluminescent creatures that provided light in those dark depths. The palace was said to be located near Aegae, in Euboea, though some sources place it elsewhere. In these halls, Poseidon kept stables filled with white horses that could run across the surface of the water as easily as land horses ran across fields. These were not ordinary horses, but divine creatures, perhaps the ancestors of the hippocampi, the horsefish hybrids that would later be said to pull his chariot. As god of the seas, Poseidon's domain extended to all waters, the oceans, certainly, but also rivers, lakes, springs, and even the water that flowed beneath the earth. He became the patron of sailors and fishermen, those who made their living from the sea, and who knew better than anyone how quickly his mood could change. One moment the seas might be calm and favorable, the next they could be roiling with waves that would smash even the sturdiest ship to splinters. But Poseidon's power was not limited to water. The ancient Greeks understood something that modern geology has confirmed. Earthquakes often occur near or beneath bodies of water, particularly around coastlines. They attributed these terrifying phenomena to Poseidon striking the earth with his trident. When the ground shook and buildings crumbled and the earth split open, it was Poseidon's doing. This earned him the title Enosikthon or Enosigaios, which means earth-shaker, a name that was used as often as his proper name in ancient prayers and poetry. There was a third aspect to Poseidon's divine portfolio, one that seems strange at first glance, but makes more sense when we understand the ancient Greek view of the world. Poseidon was also closely associated with horses. In fact, he was credited with creating the first horse, and he was worshipped as Poseidon Hippios, Poseidon of the horses. This might seem odd for a sea god, but the connection becomes clearer when we remember the alternative version of his birth, in which his mother disguised him as a foal to save him from Cronus. The horse, in ancient times, was associated with water and springs. The Greek word for horse and the word for springs shared linguistic roots. Additionally, horses were seen as creatures of immense power and somewhat unpredictable nature, much like the sea itself. The pounding of horses' hooves sounded like waves crashing on shore. The foam of the sea resembled a horse's white mane. In Poseidon, these elements merged. According to various myths, Poseidon created the first horse in different ways. In one version, he was competing with Athena for the patronage of Athens, and as his gift to the city, he struck a rock with his trident, and the first horse sprang forth, though we'll explore that contest more thoroughly shortly. In another version, he was pursuing the goddess Demeter, who transformed herself into a mare to escape his advances. Poseidon, not to be deterred, transformed himself into a stallion, and from their union, the divine horse Arion was born. a horse that could run faster than the wind and even speak with a human voice. The earth itself, the solid ground upon which mortals walked, was left as common ground, belonging to all three brothers and to the other gods as well. It was the realm where gods and mortals interacted most directly, where temples were built and sacrifices offered, where heroes walked and monsters lurked. But while the earth was shared, the domains of sky, sea, and underworld were each under the absolute authority of one of the three brothers. An oath sworn on the river Styx, which flowed between the earth and the underworld, was binding even to the gods themselves. But within their own realms, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades were supreme. Poseidon took to his new role with enthusiasm. He was not content to merely sit in his underwater palace and brood. He involved himself in the affairs of the world above, both with gods and with mortals. He took lovers, both divine and mortal. He sired children who would become heroes, monsters, and kings. He engaged in contests and rivalries with other gods. And sometimes, when his pride was wounded or his territory encroached upon, he unleashed his wrath in ways that would be remembered in myth and legend for millennia. But before we explore those stories, we must talk about love. For even gods, perhaps especially gods, are moved by matters of the heart. And Poseidon, despite his fierce reputation, despite his tempestuous nature, despite being the god of the storm and the earthquake and the drowning wave, fell in love. The object of his affection was a Nereid, a sea nymph, one of the 50 daughters of Nereus, the old man of the sea. Her name was Amphitrite, and winning her heart would prove to be one of Poseidon's most challenging conquests. Love for the gods was rarely simple. Amphitrite was one of the 50 Nereids, beautiful sea nymphs who dwelt in the depths and personified the various aspects of the ocean. She was said to be the eldest, or at least the most prominent, of these sisters, and she embodied the seas themselves, the loud moaning mother of fish and seals and dolphins, the third one who encircles the world, as her name might suggest. Poseidon first laid eyes on Amphitrite while she was dancing with her sisters on the shores of the island of Naxos. The Nereids were known for their grace and beauty, and as they moved across the sand with their liquid feet, their forms illuminated by moonlight and bioluminescence, they were a sight to enchant any who saw them. But it was Amphitrite who caught Poseidon's attention. Something about the way she moved, the way she laughed with her sisters, the wildness and freedom in her eyes captivated him completely. He approached her, and with all the authority of a king and all the passion of a god newly in love, he asked for her hand in marriage. But Amphitrite was not easily won. She was a virgin goddess, content with her sisters and her life in the deep places of the sea. She had seen what happened to nymphs who caught the attention of powerful gods. She knew the stories of Zeus and his conquests, and she suspected that Poseidon, his brother, might be cut from similar cloth. The idea of giving up her independence, of becoming the wife of the god of the seas, and thus subordinate to him, held no appeal. So she fled, not just away from Naxos, but to the very ends of the earth. Some accounts say she ran to the Atlas Mountains in far-off North Africa, to the westernmost edge of the known world. Others say she hid in the ocean, the great river that the Greeks believed encircled all the lands, seeking refuge with Oceanus and Tethys, the Titans who ruled those distant waters. Wherever she went, she hoped that distance would cool Poseidon's ardor, that he would find someone else to pursue and leave her in peace. But Poseidon was not so easily dissuaded. He was a god who commanded the seas, who could summon storms and calm waves with a gesture. He was not accustomed to being denied what he wanted. He sent his servants to search for Amphitrite, creatures of the deep who could travel swiftly and who knew every current and every hidden grotto where a fleeing nymph might hide. It was a dolphin who found her. His name was Delphinus, and he was not just any dolphin, but a god in his own right, one of Poseidon's most trusted servants. Delphinus tracked Amphitrite to her hiding place, wherever that was, and instead of simply reporting back to Poseidon, he did something remarkable. He spoke to her. He pleaded Poseidon's case. He told her of the god's genuine affection, of the honor that would be hers as queen of the seas, of the life they could build together. Delphinus was eloquent and persuasive, but more than that, he was honest. He did not hide Poseidon's tempestuous nature or his pride, but he spoke of the god's loneliness, of how deeply Amphitrite had affected him, of how this was not merely lust, but something deeper and more genuine. Perhaps it was Delphinus's honesty that swayed her. Perhaps it was the realization that she could not hide forever. Perhaps, in her time away, Amphitrite had found that she missed the sea that Poseidon ruled, and that returning meant dealing with its king. Or perhaps, as some of the ancient poets suggested, she had begun to feel something for Poseidon as well, a connection that both frightened and intrigued her. Whatever the reason, Amphitrite agreed to return and to marry Poseidon. Poseidon was overjoyed. As a reward for his service, he placed Delphinus among the stars, creating the constellation Delphinus that still wheels overhead every night, an eternal reminder of the dolphin who brought the Sea King and his queen together. The wedding of Poseidon and Amphitrite was a magnificent affair, celebrated throughout the oceans. Tritons, the mermen who served Poseidon, blew their conch shells to announce the union. Sea creatures of all kinds gathered to witness the marriage. The other gods attended as well, for this was the wedding of one of the great Olympians, and such an event could not be ignored. Even Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself, attended and gave Amphitrite a wedding gift, a crown of roses and a purple cloak that shimmered like the twilight sea. Amphitrite became not just Poseidon's wife, but his queen, co-ruler of the ocean realm. Unlike Hera, who spent much of her time on Olympus and devoted considerable energy to punishing Zeus's many lovers, Amphitrite seemed content in her underwater kingdom. She bore Poseidon several children who would become important figures in the mythological landscape. Their most famous child was Triton, a merman who was half man and half fish. Triton had his father's strength and his mother's grace, and he became Poseidon's herald and messenger. He carried a conch shell that, when blown, could calm the waves or summon storms, making him a figure both loved and feared by sailors. Triton would later marry Libya and have children of his own, extending the divine line into the distant corners of the ancient world. Amphitrite and Poseidon also had daughters. Rhode, associated with the island of Rhodes, is mentioned by some ancient sources as their daughter, though her parentage is disputed in the mythological tradition, with other accounts giving her different parents. Benthesicyme was another daughter, a goddess of the waves who married a mortal king of Ethiopia and served as a foster mother to various children. Cymopolea, goddess of violent sea storms and storm waves, was also counted among their daughters. She would marry Briareus, one of the Hecatoncheires, those 100-handed giants who had helped the Olympians win the war against the Titans. The marriage between Poseidon and Amphitrite appears to have been, by the standards of the Olympian gods, relatively stable. This is not to say that Poseidon was faithful. He was not. But Amphitrite seems to have been more tolerant of his extramarital affairs than Hera was of Zeus's. Perhaps this was because Amphitrite was secure in her position as queen of the seas, or perhaps it was simply her nature to be more forgiving. The ancient stories rarely show her plotting revenge against Poseidon's lovers the way Hera did. There was one notable exception, however. When Poseidon became enamored with a beautiful sea nymph named Scylla, daughter of the sea god Phorcys, Amphitrite's jealousy finally ignited. She could not act against Poseidon directly. He was too powerful and too much her equal. But Scylla was vulnerable. Amphitrite cast magic herbs into the bath where Scylla liked to bathe, and when the nymph entered the water, she was transformed into a monster. Her lower body became a mass of snapping dog heads, 12 feet sprouted from her torso, and 6 long necks rose from her shoulders, each topped with a head full of razor-sharp teeth. Scylla, in her horror and rage, retreated to a narrow strait of water between Sicily and the Italian mainland, where she would terrorize sailors for generations. alongside another monster named Charybdis, who some said was also a child of Poseidon. But this incident aside, Amphitrite maintained her dignity and her position. She ruled alongside Poseidon in their underwater palaces, and together they maintained order in the vast realm of the seas. She was depicted in ancient art as a beautiful woman, sometimes riding in a chariot pulled by hippocampi, sometimes standing beside Poseidon with her own trident or with a fish in her hand, sometimes crowned with crab claws to mark her as a sea goddess. She was not as prominent in the myths as some other divine consorts, but she was respected and her authority acknowledged. When the hero Theseus, who was himself Poseidon's son, dove into the sea to prove his divine parentage, it was Amphitrite who gave him the crown that would prove his connection to the god of the seas. With his marriage secured and his realm established, Poseidon settled into the role of one of the great Olympian gods. But divinity, especially Greek divinity, was never a peaceful existence. The gods were constantly involved in the affairs of mortals, constantly competing with each other for honor and worship, constantly testing the boundaries of their power and authority. And Poseidon, with his fierce pride and his tempestuous nature, would find himself at the center of some of mythology's most famous conflicts. From his palace beneath the waves, Poseidon ruled the seas with absolute authority. When he was pleased, the waters were calm, the winds favorable, and sailors made swift and safe passages. When he was angry, storms arose from nowhere, waves tall as mountains crashed upon shores, and ships were torn apart as easily as a child might tear a leaf. The ocean was his to command, and it obeyed his every whim. But his power was not limited to the surface of the sea. Poseidon could cause springs to burst forth from solid rock, bringing fresh water to dry land, or, just as easily, salt water that was useless for drinking. He commanded the creatures of the deep, from the smallest fish to the largest whales, from gentle dolphins to monstrous krakens that lurked in the darkest trenches. Sea serpents answered his call. The hippocampi, those horses with the tails of fish, pulled his chariot across the waves. As the earthshaker, Poseidon held even more terrifying power. With a strike of his trident against the ground, he could cause earthquakes that would level cities and split mountains. The ancient Greeks, living in a region prone to seismic activity, understood the awesome and terrifying nature of earthquakes. They had seen buildings collapse, had felt the ground shake beneath their feet, had watched as the very earth opened up in great cracks. To them, these were not impersonal geological events, but the direct intervention of an angry god. When Poseidon moved across the seas, it was not by swimming or sailing. He rode in a chariot of gold or bronze, depending on the telling, pulled by creatures that were half horse and half fish. These hippocampi would race across the surface of the water, their hooves striking the waves and leaving foam in their wake, while sea creatures great and small scattered before them or followed behind in a procession of divine power. Tritons would blow their conch shells to announce his coming, and the seas themselves would part to make way for his passage. Yet despite all this power, despite being one of the three kings of the cosmos, Poseidon was not content. He wanted more. He wanted recognition. He wanted worship. And he wanted, above all, to be honored by the great cities of mankind. For what use was divine power if mortals did not acknowledge it? What meaning did his kingship have if no temples were raised in his name, no sacrifices made at his altars, no prayers offered for his favor? This desire for mortal recognition would lead Poseidon into conflicts with other gods, most notably with his niece Athena, the goddess of wisdom. Their most famous contest took place in Attica, over the patronage of what would become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, Athens. The city that would become Athens had been recently founded by King Cecrops, a strange being who was human from the waist up, but had the tail of a serpent instead of legs. His dual nature, part human and part creature of the earth, marked him as autochthonous, meaning he was born directly from the earth itself. This gave him and his people a special claim to the land, a connection to Attica that went deeper than conquest or colonization. Under Cecrops's rule, the city had begun to prosper. It was situated on good land, with access to the sea, surrounded by silver mines that brought wealth, and crowned by the steep hill of the Acropolis that made it easily defensible. Both Poseidon and Athena recognized the city's potential, and both desired to become its patron deity. A patron god or goddess would be worshipped above all others in the city, would have the greatest temples built in their honor, would receive the finest sacrifices, and would, in turn, watch over the city and its people, protecting them from harm and granting them prosperity. It was a significant honor, and neither god was willing to yield to the other. Rather than fight, which might have destroyed the very city they both wished to claim, Poseidon and Athena agreed to a contest. Each would present a gift to the people of Athens, and King Cecrops would judge which gift was more valuable. Whichever god gave the better gift would become the city's patron. The contest took place on the Acropolis, the high, rocky outcrop that dominated the city. The people gathered to watch, excited and nervous in equal measure, for they knew that the outcome of this divine contest would shape their city's destiny for all time to come. Poseidon went first. He raised his mighty trident high above his head, and with tremendous force, he struck it against the rock of the Acropolis. The impact was tremendous. The ground shook, the stone split, and from the crack burst forth a spring of water. It gushed up with great force, forming a pool on the spot where Poseidon had struck. The people gasped in amazement. Water, after all, was life. A source of fresh water in the heart of the city would be invaluable. But as the people approached to taste the water, they discovered something disappointing. The spring was salt water, as briny and undrinkable as the sea itself. While impressive, and certainly a display of Poseidon's power, it was not particularly useful. Some versions of the myth say that Poseidon also created the first horse as his gift, striking the ground and causing a magnificent stallion to spring forth. The horse was certainly more useful than salt water. It could be ridden in war, used for transportation, and bred to create more horses. But even so, there was a problem. The gift of the horse was singular. One horse, no matter how magnificent, could only benefit one person at a time. Then it was Athena's turn. She did not strike the ground with a weapon or call upon dramatic displays of power. Instead, she knelt down and planted something in the earth. Immediately, miraculously, an olive tree sprang up, full-grown and laden with fruit. Its branches spread wide, offering shade from the hot Mediterranean sun. Its fruit could be eaten for food. Its oil could be used for cooking, for lamps, for trade. Even the wood of non-fruiting trees could be used for building or burned for warmth. And olive trees, once planted, would produce for generations, providing not just immediate benefit, but long-term prosperity. The choice was clear to Cecrops and the people of Athens. While Poseidon had offered power and spectacle, Athena had offered something practical, something that would benefit everyone, something that represented not just might, but wisdom and forethought. Cecrops declared Athena the winner, and the city was named Athens in her honor. Poseidon was furious. His pride, always his greatest weakness, had been wounded in front of mortals and gods alike. He had been judged inferior to Athena, a goddess who was not even of his generation, his brother's daughter, someone who should have deferred to him out of respect, if nothing else. In his rage, he struck the ground again with his trident, but this time not to create anything. This time, he called up a flood. The Thriasian plain, the fertile land west of Athens, was inundated with seawater. Crops were destroyed. Homes were damaged. The people cried out in fear and desperation. Zeus intervened before Poseidon could do more damage, commanding his brother to cease and accept the judgment that had been made. Poseidon complied, but grudgingly. Some say he placed a curse on Athens, condemning the city to always struggle to find fresh water during the summer months. A problem that, remarkably, Athens did face throughout antiquity and continues to deal with to this day. Despite losing the contest, Poseidon was not forgotten in Athens. The Erechtheion, one of the great temples built on the Acropolis, was dedicated to both Athena and Poseidon. Inside, the marks from Poseidon's trident could be seen on the rock, and the well of salt water he had created was preserved as a sacred site. The Athenians were practical people. They knew that while Athena might be their patron, they still lived near the sea. They still needed Poseidon's favor for their ships to sail safely, for their fishing to be productive, for their city to prosper. So they honored both gods, though Athena always held the primary place. The rivalry between Poseidon and Athena would continue throughout Greek mythology. Later, during the Trojan War, they would again find themselves on opposite sides of conflicts, with Athena generally favoring cleverness and strategy, while Poseidon relied on power and force. But we'll explore that war in more detail shortly. For now, what matters is understanding that Poseidon's defeat in Athens shaped him. It made him more determined to establish his importance, more sensitive to perceived slights, more willing to unleash his wrath when he felt he was not being given the respect he deserved. And that wrath could be terrible indeed, as many mortals and even some gods would learn to their sorrow. While his marriage to Amphitrite provided Poseidon with legitimate heirs and a stable household, the god of the seas, like most of the Olympians, was not content with a single partner. His lovers were numerous, spanning both divine beings and mortals, and from these unions came a vast and varied array of children. Some of these offspring would become heroes, founders of great cities and dynasties. Others would become monsters, feared and hunted by those same heroes. Still others fell somewhere in between, neither fully heroic nor monstrous, but complex beings who walked the line between the mortal and divine worlds. Let us speak first of Triton, his most famous legitimate child. Triton was born of Amphitrite and Poseidon, and he was a merman, human from the waist up, but possessing the tail of a fish below. He inherited his father's strength and his dominion over the seas, though on a smaller scale. Triton became Poseidon's herald, the one who would announce the sea god's presence and carry out his commands. He carried a conch shell that, when blown, could control the tides and calm or raise storms. Triton was generally benevolent, helping shipwrecked sailors and guiding vessels through treacherous waters, though like all sea deities, he could be dangerous when angered. He eventually married Libya, and their children would become important figures in North African mythology. But it was Poseidon's illegitimate children, the products of his many affairs, who would have the most dramatic impact on Greek mythology. Among the most famous of these was Theseus, the great hero of Athens. Theseus's parentage was unique even by mythological standards. His mother was Aethra, a princess of Troezen. The ancient sources present different versions of his conception. In one account, Poseidon visited Aethra while she walked along the beach. In another, King Aegeus of Athens came to Troezen and, after drinking wine provided by Aethra's father, spent the night with the princess. The most intriguing interpretation suggests that both encounters happened on the same night, giving Theseus two fathers, one mortal and one divine. This dual heritage, whether literally true or symbolically meaningful, gave him the strength and abilities of a demigod while maintaining his legitimate claim to the mortal throne of Athens. Theseus would grow up to become one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology, second perhaps only to Heracles. He slew the Minotaur in the labyrinth of Crete, united the various villages of Attica under Athenian rule, and performed numerous other heroic deeds. His connection to Poseidon was proven on several occasions, most famously when King Minos challenged his divine parentage. Theseus dove into the sea to retrieve a ring that Minos had thrown overboard, and while beneath the waves, he was welcomed into Poseidon's palace, where Amphitrite herself gave him a crown to prove his connection to the sea god. Throughout his adventures, Theseus could call upon his divine father for aid, though Poseidon's help was not always forthcoming or predictable. On the opposite end of the heroic spectrum was Polyphemus, the most famous of all Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were a race of giants, each possessing a single eye in the center of their forehead. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon and the sea nymph Thusa. He lived on the island of Sicily, where he tended sheep and lived a solitary, brutish existence. Unlike the civilized Cyclopes who had forged weapons for the gods during the Titanomachy, Polyphemus was savage and uncivilized, a creature who recognized no laws and honored no customs of hospitality. It was Polyphemus who would, quite unintentionally, set in motion one of the most famous episodes of divine revenge in all of Greek mythology. When the hero Odysseus, returning from the Trojan War, landed on Sicily with his men, they took shelter in Polyphemus's cave. The Cyclops returned, trapped the men inside by rolling a boulder across the entrance, and proceeded to eat several of them. Odysseus, ever cunning, got Polyphemus drunk on strong wine, and then, while the giants slept, heated a sharpened stake in the fire and drove it into the Cyclops' single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus roared in pain and his fellow Cyclopes came running to see what was wrong, Odysseus' earlier trick came into play. He had told Polyphemus that his name was Nobody, so when the Cyclopes asked who was hurting him, Polyphemus cried out that nobody was attacking him, and his brethren, thinking he had gone mad, left him alone. Odysseus and his surviving men escaped by clinging to the undersides of Polyphemus's sheep as they went out to pasture. But as they sailed away, Odysseus, in a moment of hubris that he would come to bitterly regret, revealed his true name to the blinded Cyclops, boasting of his cleverness. Polyphemus, hearing his tormentor's real name, called out to his father Poseidon, praying for vengeance. He asked that Odysseus either never reach home, or if fate decreed that he must eventually return, that he do so late, having lost all his ships and men, arriving on a foreign ship, and finding trouble waiting for him in his own house. Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and being a god who loved his children, even the monstrous ones, and who had a long memory for slights, he determined to make Odysseus's journey home as difficult and prolonged as possible. But we'll return to that story shortly. Another of Poseidon's famous offspring was not born in the traditional way at all. In one of the darker myths, Poseidon violated Medusa in one of Athena's temples. This desecration brought down the goddess's wrath, though tragically, her vengeance fell upon Medusa rather than Poseidon, transforming the priestess into the snake-haired monster whose gaze could turn men to stone. When the hero Perseus later beheaded Medusa, two beings sprang from her severed neck, born from the blood of her death: Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword, and Pegasus, the magnificent winged horse. Pegasus, despite his gruesome birth, became one of the most beloved creatures in Greek mythology. He could fly through the air with the speed of the wind, and he eventually became the mount of the hero Bellerophon, who rode him on various adventures, including the slaying of the Chimera. After Bellerophon's death, Pegasus was taken to Olympus, where he served Zeus by carrying his thunderbolts. Poseidon also fathered Arion, another divine horse, though the circumstances of this birth reflect the darker aspects of divine power. According to the Arcadian myths, while the goddess Demeter was searching for her daughter Persephone, who had been abducted by Hades, Poseidon pursued her with unwanted advances. To escape him, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses belonging to King Onkeos of Arcadia. But Poseidon discovered her disguise, transformed himself into a stallion, and forced himself upon her. From this violent union came two offspring: Arion, a horse with a black mane and tail, who could run faster than the wind and who, remarkably, could speak with a human voice, and Despoina, the lady, a mysterious goddess whose true name was known only to initiates of her mystery cult in Arcadia. Arion became the mount of the hero Adrastus and served him faithfully in the doomed expedition known as the Seven Against Thebes. Not all of Poseidon's children were noble or even neutral. Some were outright villains. Antaeus was a giant who lived in Libya and forced all travelers passing through his land to wrestle with him. He was unbeatable because every time he touched the earth, his mother Gaia renewed his strength. He would defeat his opponents and then kill them, using their skulls to build a temple to his father Poseidon. Only Heracles finally defeated him by lifting him off the ground and crushing him in a bear hug, preventing him from touching the earth and renewing his strength. Charybdis, who we mentioned earlier in connection with Scylla, was said by some to be Poseidon's daughter by Gaia. She was transformed into a massive whirlpool, a living maelstrom that would suck down entire ships. Together with Scylla, she made the narrow strait between Sicily and Italy one of the most dangerous passages in the Mediterranean. The Aloidae, twin giants named Otus and Ephialtes, were sons of Poseidon and Iphimedeia. These brothers were enormous even by giant standards, and as they grew, they became so arrogant that they decided to storm Olympus itself. They piled mountains on top of each other, Pelion on top of Ossa, trying to reach the home of the gods. They captured Ares, the god of war, and imprisoned him in a bronze jar for 13 months. Finally, Artemis tricked them into killing each other by transforming herself into a deer and running between them. As they both threw their spears at the deer, she dodged, and the spears struck each other instead. Poseidon also fathered numerous mortal kings and heroes who had found great cities and dynasties. Belus became the king of Egypt, an ancestor of many Egyptian royal lines. Agenor became the king of Phoenicia, and his descendants would include Europa, Cadmus, Phoenix, and Cilix, each important in their own myths. Neleus founded Pylos and became the father of Nestor, the wise old king who would play such an important role in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Peleus became king of Iolcus and would one day send his nephew Jason on the quest for the Golden Fleece. Through all these children, both divine and mortal, heroic and monstrous, Poseidon extended his influence throughout the ancient world. His bloodline ran through the veins of kings and heroes, giants and monsters. Every major adventure, every great quest, every significant conflict in Greek mythology seemed to involve at least one of Poseidon's children in some way. This was the web of relationships that the gods created, a vast network of kinship and rivalry, loyalty and betrayal that bound together the divine and mortal worlds. But of all the stories involving Poseidon and his descendants, few are as important or as well known as the role he played in the Trojan War and its aftermath. The Trojan War, that great conflict that lasted 10 years and involved nearly every major hero and god of Greek mythology, had its origins in a wedding and a golden apple. When the sea nymph Thetis married the mortal Peleus, all the gods were invited to the celebration except for one, Eris, the goddess of discord. Enraged at being snubbed, Eris threw a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest," into the middle of the feast. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Unable to decide among themselves, they called upon a mortal to judge, a Trojan prince named Paris. Each goddess tried to bribe him. Hera offered power, Athena offered wisdom and glory in war, and Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris chose Aphrodite, and in doing so, he set in motion events that would lead to the fall of Troy. When Paris abducted Helen from her husband Menelaus, king of Sparta, the Greeks assembled the greatest army ever seen, led by Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother. Heroes from across Greece answered the call, bound by oaths they had sworn to protect Helen's marriage. They sailed to Troy, laid siege to the city, and the war began. Poseidon had his own reasons for hating Troy, reasons that predated Paris and Helen by a generation. According to the myth, years before the war, Zeus had punished both Apollo and Poseidon, forcing them to serve a mortal king. They were sent to Troy in mortal guise to serve King Laomedon. During their year of service, Poseidon, with the help of the mortal hero Aeacus, built the magnificent walls around Troy, walls so strong that, the myths claimed, no army could breach them. These were the famous walls of Troy, supposedly erected by divine hands. When the year was complete, Laomedon was expected to pay Apollo and Poseidon for their labor, but according to the tradition, he refused. Some versions even say he threatened to cut off their ears and sell them as slaves. Apollo and Poseidon returned to Olympus and resumed their divine forms, but the insult was not forgotten. Apollo sent a plague upon Troy, and Poseidon sent a sea monster to terrorize the coastline. The monster was eventually killed by Heracles, but only after Laomedon had promised divine horses as payment, a promise he again broke. This cycle of broken oaths and unpaid debts meant that Poseidon's anger at the Trojan royal family ran deep. So when the Trojan War began, Poseidon sided with the Greeks, eager for revenge against the descendants of Laomedon. Throughout the war, he aided the Greek forces in various ways. He encouraged their troops with inspiring speeches, sometimes appearing disguised as various Greek leaders. He even entered the battle himself on occasion, fighting alongside mortal warriors and driving the Trojans back toward their walls. His interventions were crucial at several key points in the conflict. When Achilles withdrew from the fighting after his quarrel with Agamemnon, and the Trojans began pushing the Greeks back toward their ships, it was Poseidon who rallied the defenders and helped prevent a complete rout. However, Poseidon's active support for the Greeks was not without its complications. He clashed with Zeus over the course of the war. Zeus, as king of the gods, sought to maintain some balance, or had his own plans for how events should unfold, while Poseidon wanted to take a more direct role in aiding the Greeks. There were times when Zeus had to order Poseidon to withdraw from the battlefield and let events play out as fate decreed. These conflicts between the brothers, played out on the cosmic stage while mortals fought and died below, demonstrated that even among the gods, there was no unified purpose or single vision of how the war should proceed. As the war dragged on, Poseidon watched the Greeks struggle. He had helped them build their fortifications, had encouraged them in battle, had even saved individual heroes when they were in danger. But Troy would not fall, not while its walls stood, walls that Poseidon himself had built. It was a bitter irony. The thing he had created as punishment had become the main obstacle to his revenge. The war finally ended through trickery rather than force. Odysseus devised the plan of the wooden horse, a giant hollow structure built in the shape of a horse, ostensibly as an offering to Athena, but actually filled with Greek warriors. The Greeks pretended to sail away, leaving the horse on the beach. A Greek spy named Sinon convinced the Trojans that the horse was a sacred offering and that bringing it into the city would ensure Troy's protection. Not all Trojans were convinced. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, famously warned his people with the words that would echo through history: "Beware Greeks bearing gifts." He even threw a spear into the horse's side to demonstrate his suspicion. But then, in a moment that sealed Troy's fate, two enormous sea serpents emerged from the waters and attacked Laocoon and his sons, crushing them in their coils. The Trojans, witnessing this terrible sight, interpreted it as divine punishment for Laocoon's disrespect toward the gift. In most versions of the myth, it was Poseidon who sent these serpents, though some accounts attribute them to Apollo. Regardless of which god sent them, the message was clear, and the Trojans, now afraid to reject the horse, brought it within their walls. That night, the warriors emerged, opened the city gates for the returning Greek army, and Troy was sacked. Poseidon watched as the city burned, as King Priam was killed at the altar of Zeus, as Hector's infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls, as Cassandra was dragged from Athena's temple, as the Trojan women were divided among the Greek victors as prizes. His revenge against Laomedon's line was complete. Troy, the city whose walls he had built, was destroyed, never to rise again in the same glory. But if Poseidon thought the war's end would bring him satisfaction, he was mistaken. For in the sack of Troy, the Greeks committed terrible crimes. They desecrated temples, murdered suppliants, who had sought sanctuary, enslaved noble women, and generally conducted themselves without honor or restraint. Athena, whose temple had been particularly profaned when Ajax the Lesser raped Cassandra at her altar, was furious. And Poseidon, despite his hatred for Troy, was also offended by the Greeks' behavior. So when the Greek fleet set sail for home, Poseidon and Athena conspired together. They sent a great storm that scattered the ships, drowning hundreds of warriors who had survived 10 years of warfare only to die within sight of home. Ajax the Lesser, who had committed the rape of Cassandra, was shipwrecked on a rock. When he boasted that he would survive despite the god's wrath, Poseidon himself struck the rock with his trident, splitting it apart and drowning the blasphemer. For most of the Greek heroes, the journey home was long and difficult, filled with monsters and delays and misfortunes. But for one hero in particular, the journey would become a legendary ordeal. That hero was Odysseus, and his troubles had only just begun. Of all the many curses and revenges that Poseidon enacted throughout Greek mythology, none is more detailed or more famous than his persecution of Odysseus. This story, told in Homer's epic The Odyssey, would become one of the foundational narratives of Western literature, and at its heart was the anger of the god of the seas. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, a small, rocky island off the western coast of Greece. He was known for his cleverness and his silver tongue, for being able to talk his way out of almost any situation, and to devise solutions to seemingly impossible problems. It was Odysseus who had conceived the plan of the Trojan horse, who had convinced the Greeks not to abandon the war when morale was at its lowest, who had served as an ambassador and negotiator throughout the conflict. He was not the strongest warrior, that was Achilles. He was not the most noble, that was perhaps Hector. But he was the cleverest, and that cleverness would be both his greatest asset and, ultimately, the source of his greatest suffering. After the sack of Troy, Odysseus and his men set sail for home. Ithaca was not far, and under normal circumstances, the journey should have taken only a few days, perhaps a week or two at most. Odysseus had left behind his wife Penelope and his infant son Telemachus, and he was eager to return to them. He had been away for 10 years fighting the war, and he longed for his home, his kingdom, and his family. But normal circumstances, as we have seen, were not what awaited the Greek fleet. The storm that Poseidon and Athena sent scattered the ships. Odysseus's vessels were blown off course, driven into unknown waters far from the familiar trade routes that connected Greece with Troy. And then, to make matters much worse, Odysseus did something that would earn him Poseidon's personal and undying enmity. The fleet made landfall on an island that was home to the Cyclopes. Odysseus, always curious, took a small group of men to explore. They found a cave filled with food, cheeses, lambs, all the supplies a shepherd might need. Odysseus wanted to wait and meet the owner, but his men urged him to take what they could and leave. Odysseus, fatefully, insisted on staying. The owner of the cave was Polyphemus, the giant son of Poseidon. When he returned and found strangers in his home, he rolled a massive boulder across the entrance, trapping them inside. Then, without warning or negotiation, he snatched up 2 of Odysseus's men and ate them raw, crushing their bodies and devouring them while Odysseus and the others watched in horror. This happened again at the next meal and the next. The Cyclops was treating them like cattle, keeping them penned up to be slaughtered and eaten at his leisure. Odysseus, thinking quickly, devised a plan. He offered Polyphemus strong wine, which the Cyclops, who had never tasted such a drink, guzzled down eagerly. As Polyphemus grew drunk, he asked Odysseus his name. "Nobody," Odysseus replied. "My name is Nobody." Polyphemus, in his drunken generosity, said that he would eat Nobody last, as a guest gift. Then he fell into a deep, wine-soaked sleep. Odysseus and his men heated a massive wooden stake in the fire until it glowed red. Then, coordinating their efforts, they drove the burning point into Polyphemus's single eye, twisting it and grinding it until the eye was destroyed. Polyphemus awoke screaming, his howls so loud that other Cyclopes came running to see what was wrong. "Who is hurting you?" they called. "What's happening?" "Nobody!" Polyphemus roared. "Nobody is killing me! Nobody has blinded me!" The other Cyclopes, thinking he had gone mad or was simply drunk, left him to his suffering. The next morning, still blind and in terrible pain, Polyphemus rolled away the stone to let his sheep out to pasture. But he sat in the entrance, running his hands over each sheep's back to make sure no men escaped. Odysseus, ever clever, had tied his men and himself to the undersides of the sheep. As each sheep passed out of the cave, it carried a Greek clinging to its belly. Polyphemus, feeling only the sheep's backs, let them pass. Once free and back aboard their ships, Odysseus should have simply sailed away. He should have counted his blessings, mourned his lost men, and disappeared into the sea before Polyphemus could discover his deception. But Odysseus, normally so clever, committed an act of extraordinary hubris. As his ships moved away from shore, he called back to the Cyclops, taunting him. Polyphemus heard his voice and hurled massive boulders in the direction of the sound, nearly swamping the ships with the waves they created. Odysseus's men begged him to stop, to be silent, to let them escape. But Odysseus, his pride inflamed by his own cleverness, called out again. This time, he revealed his true name. "If anyone asks who blinded you," he shouted across the water, "tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca, sacker of cities." Polyphemus stopped throwing boulders. He stood on the shore, his ruined eye weeping, and raised his arms to the sky. "Father Poseidon," he prayed, "hear me. Grant that Odysseus, if he is fated to return home at all, may do so late, after many sufferings, having lost all his companions on a foreign ship, and may he find trouble waiting in his household." Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and because Polyphemus was his child, because the insult was real and the harm done, and because Poseidon was a god who honored his family above all else, he determined to grant that prayer to the fullest extent that fate would allow. From that moment on, every stage of Odysseus's journey home was complicated by Poseidon's interference. Not every disaster that befell Odysseus can be directly attributed to the sea god. The hero's own poor judgment and the foolishness of his crew caused many problems. But again and again, when Odysseus seemed to be making progress, when he seemed close to reaching home, Poseidon would intervene to drive him back into unknown waters, to scatter his fleet, to prolong his suffering. The first major disaster came at the island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus had given Odysseus a leather bag containing all the unfavorable winds, leaving only the west wind free to blow them home to Ithaca. For 9 days they sailed, and on the 10th day they could see Ithaca's shores. Odysseus, who had been steering the ship himself for all that time, finally allowed himself to sleep. But his men, curious about the bag and suspecting it contained treasure, opened it. All the winds rushed out at once, creating a storm that drove the ships all the way back to Aeolia. Aeolus, realizing that the gods must be against Odysseus to allow such a thing to happen, refused to help again. They sailed on and came to the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships by hurling boulders at them and then eating the crews. Only Odysseus's own ship escaped, and it did so only because he had prudently anchored it outside the harbor rather than within it. With just 1 ship and a few dozen men, Odysseus continued. They reached the island of Aeaea, home of the sorceress Circe. She transformed most of his crew into pigs, but Odysseus, aided by Hermes, resisted her magic and forced her to restore his men. They stayed with Circe for a year, and she bore Odysseus a son, though he did not stay to raise the child. When they finally left, Circe warned them of the dangers ahead. The sirens, whose songs lured sailors to their deaths, the monsters Scylla and Charybdis, and the island of the sun god Helios, where cattle sacred to the god grazed. Odysseus plugged his men's ears with beeswax to protect them from the sirens, though he had himself tied to the mast so he could hear their song without being able to act on the desire to sail toward them. They navigated between Scylla and Charybdis, though Scylla snatched 6 men from the deck and devoured them. And when they reached the island of Helios, Odysseus warned his crew not to touch the sacred cattle. But while he slept, his men, starving and desperate, slaughtered and ate some of the cattle. Zeus himself punished this sacrilege. He sent a storm that destroyed the ship, killing everyone except Odysseus, who clung to wreckage and drifted for 9 days before washing up on the island of Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso. Calypso kept Odysseus as her prisoner and lover for 7 years. She wanted him to stay with her forever, even offering him immortality if he would remain and be her husband. But Odysseus, despite being unable to escape, spent his days sitting on the beach, staring at the horizon, weeping for his lost home and family. Finally, Athena appealed to Zeus on Odysseus's behalf. She pointed out that Odysseus had always been pious, had made proper sacrifices, and deserved better than to waste away on a remote island. Zeus agreed, but he could not openly defy his brother Poseidon, so he waited until Poseidon was away, visiting the Ethiopians, and then sent Hermes to command Calypso to release Odysseus. Calypso, though reluctant, obeyed. She gave Odysseus materials to build a raft and supplies for his journey. But when Poseidon returned from Ethiopia and saw Odysseus sailing across his sea, making for home at last, the god's rage erupted. He raised a terrible storm, smashing Odysseus's raft to pieces and nearly drowning him. Only the intervention of a sea goddess named Ino, who gave Odysseus her magical veil to keep him afloat, saved his life. For 2 days and nights, Odysseus swam through the stormy seas, buffeted by waves, his strength failing. Finally, he reached the island of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians. He collapsed on the shore, barely alive. The next day, he was found by Nausicaa, daughter of the Phaeacian king, who brought him to her father's palace. The Phaeacians were a people beloved by the gods, and they made it their custom to help stranded travelers reach their homes. King Alcinous, after hearing Odysseus's story, provided him with a ship and crew to take him back to Ithaca. The Phaeacian ship was magical, faster than any bird, able to find its way without a helmsman. While Odysseus slept, exhausted from his ordeals, the ship carried him across the sea and delivered him to Ithaca's shores, finally, after 10 years of wandering. But Poseidon was not finished. He was furious that the Phaeacians had helped Odysseus, despite knowing of his curse. He turned their ship to stone, just as it was entering the harbour of Scheria, as a warning to them never to aid travellers in this way again. As for Odysseus, he had finally reached home, but as Polyphemus had prayed, he arrived late, having lost all his companions on a foreign ship. And he found trouble waiting in his household, as over 100 suitors had taken over his palace, eating his food, drinking his wine, courting his wife, and plotting to kill his son. But those troubles were mortal troubles, and they could be dealt with by mortal means. Poseidon's curse had run its course. The sea god's wrath was satisfied, not because Odysseus had apologized or made amends, but simply because time and suffering had fulfilled the terms of Polyphemus's prayer. The persecution of Odysseus stands as perhaps the most detailed account of Poseidon's wrath in all of Greek mythology. It shows us both the god's power, his ability to torment a single mortal for years on end, and his limitations, for despite all his efforts, he could not actually prevent Odysseus from returning home. Fate had decreed that Odysseus would return, and even Poseidon could not overturn fate entirely. He could only make the journey as difficult as possible, adding years of suffering to what should have been a short voyage. But the persecution of Odysseus was only one chapter in the much longer story of Poseidon's involvement in mortal affairs. Throughout Greek mythology, the sea god appears again and again, sometimes as helper, sometimes as adversary, always as a powerful and unpredictable force. Beyond the grand epics of war and revenge, Poseidon wove his way through countless other myths and legends. His presence felt in stories both famous and obscure. His power, his pride, and his passions continue to shape the fates of gods and mortals alike. One of the most famous myths involving Poseidon concerns King Minos of Crete and the origin of the Minotaur. Minos, seeking to prove his divine right to rule Crete, prayed to Poseidon for a sign. The sea god responded by sending a magnificent white bull from the sea, with the understanding that Minos would sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon after his claim to the throne was secured. The bull was so beautiful, so perfect, that the Cretans immediately acknowledged Minos as their rightful king. But Minos, like so many mortals in Greek myths, thought he could deceive the gods. Instead of sacrificing the white bull, he kept it for himself, adding it to his herds, and sacrificed a different bull in its place. Poseidon, of course, knew what Minos had done, and he was not amused. As punishment, he cursed Minos' wife, Pasiphae, causing her to fall into an unnatural lust for the white bull. Pasiphae, desperate and ashamed, enlisted the help of Daedalus, the master craftsman, to construct a hollow wooden cow covered in hide. She climbed inside this contraption, and when the white bull mounted what it thought was a cow, Pasiphae conceived. The child born from this unholy union was the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man but the head of a bull. The Minotaur was monstrous in both appearance and appetite, eating human flesh and growing more savage with each passing year. Minos, horrified but unable to kill the creature that was, after all, his wife's child, commanded Daedalus to build a labyrinth beneath the palace, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way out. The Minotaur was placed at the labyrinth's center, and every 9 years, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute. These youths were sent into the labyrinth to be devoured by the monster, payment for Athens having killed Minos' son years before. This continued until Theseus, Poseidon's own son, volunteered to be one of the tributes. With the help of Minos' daughter Ariadne, who gave him a ball of thread to mark his path, Theseus navigated the labyrinth, slew the Minotaur, and escaped. Thus, Poseidon's vengeance against Minos ultimately led to the creature's death at the hands of the sea god's own child, one of those strange circles that Greek mythology was full of. Poseidon's relationship with Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was another tale that reflects the complex and often troubling nature of divine power in Greek mythology. According to the Arcadian tradition, while Demeter was searching for her daughter Persephone, who had been abducted by Hades, Poseidon pursued her. Demeter, consumed with grief over her daughter and having no interest in his advances, transformed herself into a mare and hid among the horses of King Onkeos, hoping her disguise would allow her to escape notice. But Poseidon was not deterred. He transformed himself into a stallion and, discovering her among the herd, forced himself upon her. The mythological texts are clear about the violent nature of this encounter. From this union came 2 offspring, Arion, the divine horse who could speak and run faster than the wind, and Despoina, a goddess of mystery whose cult was practiced in Arcadia. Demeter's reaction to this violation, as the myths tell it, was profound. She withdrew to a cave, refusing to emerge or allow the earth to produce crops until she had purified herself by washing in the river Ladon. The ancient Greeks called her Demeter Erinis, Demeter the Fury, in memory of her rage. This myth, with its themes of violation and the disruption of natural order, reflects some of the darker realities of how the ancient Greeks conceived of divine power and the relationships between gods. Yet not all of Poseidon's interventions in mortal affairs were born of anger or lust. Sometimes he helped, particularly when properly honored or when his interest aligned with a mortal's cause. He aided the hero Pelops win his bride Hippodamia by providing him with winged horses that could outrace those of her father King Oenomaus. He saved the musician Arion from pirates by sending dolphins to rescue him after he was thrown overboard. He assisted various city founders and colonists by calming seas and creating harbors where none had existed before. Poseidon was also deeply involved in the generation of heroes that followed the Trojan War. His grandson, Neleus, founded Pylos, and Neleus's son Nestor became one of the most respected figures in Greek mythology, a wise counselor who served in both the war against Troy and as an advisor to younger generations. Poseidon's bloodline ran through the royal houses of multiple cities, and through these descendants, his influence continued to shape events long after his direct interventions had ceased. Throughout all these myths, certain patterns emerge in Poseidon's character. He was, above all, a god of extremes. When calm, the seas were smooth and favorable, but when angered, his wrath was terrible and often disproportionate to the offense. He was fiercely protective of his children and his honor, willing to hold grudges for years or even decades. He was passionate and lustful, taking what he wanted regardless of the wishes of others. He valued strength and displays of power, but he could also be cunning when the situation called for it. Unlike some gods, who seemed to have clear moral alignments, who consistently acted as forces for good or evil, Poseidon was more complex. He could be a benefactor or a destroyer, sometimes both in the same myth. He represented the fundamental unpredictability of the natural world. The sea, after all, gives life through fishing and trade, through rain and rivers, but it also takes life through storms and shipwrecks and drownings. Poseidon embodied this duality, and throughout all the myths, one thing remained constant. Poseidon demanded respect, whether from gods or mortals, whether through proper sacrifices and prayers, or simply through acknowledgement of his power. Poseidon required that his status be recognized. Those who honored him could expect his favor, or at least his neutrality. Those who slighted him, whether intentionally like Minos or accidentally like Odysseus, would feel the full weight of his divine wrath. The ancient Greeks who told these stories understood that they were not just entertaining tales, but lessons about the world they lived in. The sea was central to Greek life. Greece is a country of islands and peninsulas, surrounded by water on nearly all sides. The sea provided food and trade routes, connected scattered communities, and allowed for the exchange of ideas and goods. But it was also dangerous. Storms could rise with little warning, ships could be dashed against rocks, entire fleets could be lost. In Poseidon, the Greeks gave this reality a face and a name, a personality and a story. They could pray to him, offer him sacrifices, and hope that he would be merciful. They could tell stories of heroes who had won his favor or suffered his wrath, and in those stories, they could find both entertainment and instruction on how to navigate not just the physical seas, but the dangerous waters of divine attention. As with all the Olympian gods, the worship of Poseidon was widespread throughout the ancient Greek world. He was honored with temples, festivals, and sacrifices, particularly in coastal communities, where his favor was essential to daily life. The ancient Greeks understood that while he might not be the king of the gods, while Zeus might hold the supreme authority, Poseidon's domain touched nearly every aspect of their existence. The most famous temple dedicated to Poseidon stood at Cape Sunion, on a promontory overlooking the Aegean Sea. This temple, built in the 5th century before the Common Era, was positioned on a cliff high above the waves, a beacon visible to sailors approaching Athens from the sea. When ships rounded the cape and saw the temple's marble columns gleaming white against the sky, they knew they were almost home, and captains would offer prayers of thanks to Poseidon for bringing them safely to port. The ruins of this temple still stand today, one of the most photographed archaeological sites in Greece, and visitors continue to be moved by its dramatic location and the enduring power of its architecture. Another major center of Poseidon worship was at the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Here, the sanctuary of Poseidon hosted the Isthmian Games, one of the 4 Pan-Hellenic Games along with the Olympics, the Pythian Games, and the Nemean Games. These games, held every 2 years, featured athletic competitions, chariot races, and musical contests. They were second in importance only to the Olympics, and to win at the Isthmian Games brought a victor great honor and fame. The games were held in honor of Poseidon, and victors dedicated their prizes to the god. The site also included a temple, though it was rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, and little remains of the ancient structure today. In Athens, despite losing the contest with Athena, Poseidon maintained a significant presence. The Erechtheion on the Acropolis was dedicated to both Athena and Poseidon, and inside the temple, pilgrims could see the marks left by Poseidon's trident and the well of salt water that he had created. The Athenians, practical people that they were, understood that while Athena might be their patron, they still needed Poseidon's favor for their navy, their merchant fleet, and their port at Piraeus. They celebrated festivals in his honor and maintained his cult with regular sacrifices. The sacrifices offered to Poseidon reflected his various domains and the ancient Greeks' understanding of proper worship. Black bulls were commonly sacrificed, their dark color perhaps representing the depths of the ocean or the darkness of the earth that shook during earthquakes. Horses were also offered to him, in recognition of his role as Hippios, the horse god. In some coastal regions, horses might be driven into the sea as a form of sacrifice, an ancient practice that seems cruel to modern sensibilities, but which the Greeks viewed as returning to Poseidon what he had created. These rituals were part of a worldview very different from our own, one in which the gods demanded tangible offerings in exchange for their favor. Sailors, before setting out on voyages, would pour libations into the sea, offering wine or oil directly into Poseidon's realm. They would pray for calm seas and favorable winds, and upon returning safely, they would make additional offerings in thanks. Fishermen did the same, asking Poseidon to guide their nets to where the fish were plentiful. Merchants whose ships carried trade goods across the Mediterranean maintained shrines to Poseidon in their homes and in their warehouses, knowing that their prosperity depended on the god's mercy. Various epithets were used to invoke different aspects of Poseidon's nature. He was called Enosishthon, or Enosigaios, the earth shaker, in prayers seeking protection from earthquakes. He was called Asphaleios, the securer, in his role as protector of those who traveled by sea. He was called Hippios in his role as tamer of horses. He was called Phytalmios, the nourisher, in recognition of his control over fresh water and springs. Each epithet emphasized a different aspect of his power, allowing worshippers to direct their prayers to the specific facet of Poseidon's nature most relevant to their needs. Festivals dedicated to Poseidon were celebrated throughout the year in different cities. In Athens, the Poseidonia was held in the winter month of Poseidon, which roughly corresponds to December and January in the modern calendar. This festival included sacrifices, processions, and feasting. In Corinth, festivals were held at the time of the Isthmian Games, combining athletic competition with religious observance. In coastal communities, festivals often coincided with the beginning of the sailing season in spring or the end of the season in autumn, marking times when the sea was particularly important to community life. The Romans, when they conquered Greece and adopted much of Greek religion, identified Poseidon with their own sea god Neptune. Under this name, he continued to be worshipped throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans added their own elements to his cult, but the fundamental characteristics remained the same. Neptune, like Poseidon before him, was powerful, temperamental, and essential to an empire that depended on control of the Mediterranean Sea for its prosperity and security. With the spread of Christianity and the eventual decline of the old religions, worship of Poseidon gradually ceased. Temples were abandoned, converted to churches, or demolished for building materials. The festivals stopped being celebrated, the priesthoods ended, but while the worship died, the stories remained. Greek mythology was preserved and transmitted through the centuries, studied first by Byzantine scholars, then by Islamic scholars during the Middle Ages, and finally rediscovered by Renaissance Europe. Poseidon, along with the other gods, lived on not as a deity to be worshipped, but as a character in literature, a subject for art, and a symbol of the forces he had always represented: the power of the sea, the instability of the earth, the wildness of nature that could never be fully tamed. Today, Poseidon continues to captivate. He appears in modern literature, in films, in video games, in countless retellings and reimaginings of Greek myths. Each generation finds something new in these ancient stories, some fresh interpretation or application to contemporary concerns. Poseidon's story, in particular, resonates in an age increasingly aware of the power and fragility of the oceans. Climate change is affecting sea levels and water temperatures. Marine ecosystems are under stress. The power of hurricanes and typhoons reminds us of the ocean's devastating potential. In our own way, we are still telling Poseidon's story, still grappling with humanity's complex relationship with the seas. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life of Poseidon, from his troubled birth and captivity within his father's belly, through the war against the Titans and the division of the cosmos, through his marriage and his many affairs, through his contests with other gods and his persecution of those who offended him, to his worship by the ancient Greeks and his continuing presence in our collective imagination. Poseidon was never the most important of the Olympian gods. That distinction belonged to his younger brother Zeus. He was never the wisest. That was Athena. He was never the most artistic. That was Apollo. But in his own realm, in the vast expanses of ocean that covered more of the earth's surface than all the lands combined, Poseidon was supreme. His trident could summon storms or calm seas. His wrath could strand sailors on distant shores or send them to watery graves. His favor could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty for any community that lived by the sea. More than that, Poseidon represented something fundamental about the Greek understanding of the world. The gods were not abstract philosophical principles or distant creators. They were intensely present forces, personalities with desires and anger and pride. They could be appealed to, bargained with, even sometimes tricked, but they could never be ignored. Poseidon, perhaps more than any other god except Zeus, embodied this dangerous intimacy between the divine and the mortal. He was too powerful to defy, too temperamental to predict, and too essential to daily life to risk offending. His story reminds us that power comes in many forms. It is not just about ruling from a throne or winning battles. It is about controlling the elements that life depends upon. It is about being indispensable. The ancient Greeks might build their cities on land, might look to Zeus in the sky or Athena for wisdom, but they could never forget the god who ruled the seas. Every time they looked at the water, every time they felt the ground shake, every time they heard thunder echo across the waves, they thought of Poseidon. And in thinking of him, in telling his stories, in offering their prayers and sacrifices, they were doing what humans have always done, trying to make sense of a world both beautiful and terrifying, trying to find meaning in the forces that shape our lives, trying to navigate between safety and disaster, between the known and the unknown, between the shore and the deep. The sea remains, as it was in ancient times, both highway and barrier, source of life and threat of death. We no longer believe that a god with a trident controls the tides or sends the storms, but we still respect the sea's power, still feel small in the face of its vastness, still understand that despite all our technology and knowledge, we are at the mercy of forces greater than ourselves. In that sense, Poseidon's story is eternal. The names change, the explanations become scientific rather than mythological, but the fundamental truth remains. There are powers in this world that we cannot control, and wisdom lies in acknowledging that reality rather than denying it. The ancient Greeks knew this, and they created gods like Poseidon, not to explain everything, but to give form to their understanding that the world was bigger and more dangerous. and more wonderful than any human society could fully comprehend. So tonight, as we finish this journey through the mythology of the sea god, take a moment to think about the stories we've explored. Think about the newborn swallowed by his father, the warrior who helped overthrow the Titans, the king who built palaces beneath the waves, the lover who pursued countless partners, the father of both heroes and monsters, the rival who competed for Athens, the enemy who persecuted Odysseus for 10 long years. Think about all these facets of Poseidon's character, how they fit together to create not a perfect god, not an all-good or all-evil deity, but something more complex and more human, despite his divinity. A being of tremendous power and tremendous flaws, of generosity and cruelty, of grandeur and pettiness. The gods of ancient Greece were never meant to be moral exemplars. They were meant to be explanations, stories, warnings, and occasionally inspirations. They were meant to reflect the world as the Greeks saw it, complicated, dangerous, beautiful, and ultimately beyond full human understanding. In Poseidon, all of these qualities find expression in the crash of waves, the shaking of earth, and the thunder of hooves. His story is the story of the sea itself, and like the sea, it continues to fascinate, to terrify, and to inspire. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into Greek mythology. As always, I hope you learned something new, found something to think about, or simply enjoyed the stories of gods and heroes, of monsters and mortals, of a world where the divine and the everyday intertwined in ways both marvelous and terrible. If you enjoyed tonight's episode, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps more than you might think, and it lets me know that you want more content like this. Until next time, may your seas be calm and your journeys safe. Good night.